So this episode is going to be a little weird, because not only is Doom one of the most documented video games of all time, but I ostensibly already covered Doom way back in the day, along with Doom 2 and Ultimate Doom, as kind of an amorphous blob of doominess, and then sort of covered my coverage of it in the Beginner's Guide episode, and then revisited Doom yet again when talking about Doom 2016. And I kind of want to avoid just repeating myself, at least as much as I can, so to define the scope of this conversation, I want to lay down some ground rules. First, we're talking about the original 1993 release of id Software's Doom. Not Doom 2, not Final Doom, and not Ultimate Doom that has Die Flesh consumed as a fourth episode. In previous videos, I spent a lot of time trying to contextualize the creation of Doom, and I think now would be a good time to contextualize Doom as it was played and what it means to play it now. So we're also not going to be talking about its development so much as the game as it was experienced both in 1993 and in 2020. Because Doom is old. Like, old in a way most video games don't get to be. Most video games will be playable for a hardware generation or maybe two before not only going out of print and becoming difficult to find, but being incredibly difficult to get running. Old hardware breaks, servers disappear, that sort of thing. The fate of most video games that are almost 30 years old is a pleasant but faded childhood memory of middle-aged folks. But Doom is still huge, and not just as a franchise, although certainly that's still booming too. The original game and its engine still have an active mod community. It still has an active player base, complete with YouTubers who offer up commentary on new levels and WODs that have been released recently.
And these maps are all by Pinchy, who is a Doom modder who's been around for a while, very prolific. I'm going to play a few levels from it. This first one is from episode 5, Old Money, and it's called Cross Country.
It's still getting ported to smartphones and ATMs and thermostats, and with a plugin to let GZ Doom run arcade emulators, it's even been ported to Doom itself. In short, Doom is very much still alive in a way that a lot of the games in this series will simply not be. And to that end, I think it's important to look at what the game meant when it was released, but also what it's like to play it today. So first, let's go full subjective games writing, go back to 1993, and talk about what Doom was like to play back then. I'm only 35, so I was only 8 when Doom was released. Consequently, my experience with Doom in 1993 is going to differ pretty drastically from someone who was fully grown. And while being so young plays into that, and we'll get to that in a little bit, there's one big reason why. Shareware. So, I know I said I wouldn't talk about the development of Doom all that much, but this part is something I've glossed over previously and is really relevant to how a lot of people played Doom in 1993. And that is that Doom, much like Wolfenstein 3D before it, was released as a shareware title. I'm not going to sit here and explain what shareware is, both because I feel like most of you know that already, and also because the distribution models of the 90s leading to the consolidation of the 2000s and the resurgence of independent developers in the 2010s could be a whole episode or even series unto itself. The games industry has gone through some changes. Suffice it to say that the shareware angle was an important part of Doom as it was experienced by people my age. Like, to buy the full version of Doom, you needed to call their hotline and place an order with a credit card or money order, a feat not a lot of kids could do, especially for a hyper-violent title. But copying some floppy disks for a free game the developers encouraged you to spread around? That was absolutely a thing kids could do, and often without the knowledge of their elders who, in the early 90s, were still often pretty computer illiterate. I can't tell you how many copies of the shareware version of Doom ended up on school computers I've been to for years by elementary and middle school kids, while much less tech-savvy adults could never quite stop them. To a lot of kids in the mid-90s, Doom was just knee-deep in the dead. And you would think that a game of 10 levels and 5 weapons that could be beaten casually in an hour would burn kids out quickly. But they ate it up. For years, over and over again, in part because it was free and available, but also because it was utterly unlike anything anyone had ever seen up until that point. No one was doing things that looked or played quite like Doom at the time of its release. Sure, Ultima Underworld had come out the year before with a fully realized 3D environment, but it was a clunky, slow-paced RPG, not a white-knuckle horror action title. As a shooter, Doom had a speed and immediacy about it that Ultima Underworld lacked. And other shooters of the era were still stodgy, boxy, flat games built out of mostly 90-degree angles. Heck, in 1993, Softdisk was still putting out sequels to Catacomb 3D that looked like this. Now, I'm kind of giving an unfair comparison here, because id Software GPL'd the Doom engine years ago, and we have modern ports capable of running the game silky smooth on contemporary hardware, whereas footage from the other games is mostly emulated, and Doom released at the end of 1993, whereas the other games were earlier in the year. But even if we imagine Doom running a little slower and a little chunkier, it's not hard to see the difference. Dynamic lighting allowed bulbs to flicker on and off in bloody industrial corridors, and strobe as a warning in toxic reactors on the verge of meltdown. Monsters growled from the shadows that were so pitch dark that they had to add a power-up just to give you night vision. And it wasn't just the lighting, but the geometry too. The ability to render arbitrarily angled walls and multiple ceiling and floor heights gave the maps a complexity that stood out among the flat hallways and 90-degree walls of its competitors. While Doom was technically still just a 2D map rendered in pseudo 3D, the illusion was way more powerful when you could walk up some stairs and peek through a window into the next room. Meanwhile, skybox textures meant the entire game wasn't enclosed in an interior or cloaked in fog and shadow. You could see out the window to the horizon beyond. But it wasn't just that the technology was a leap forward, it was that it enabled Doom's dark, abstract, moody tone. I've gone over this before, and I don't want to revisit it too much, but Doom really tapped into an action, sci-fi, horror, heavy metal aesthetic that was like being inside of an Iron Maiden album cover, James Cameron's Aliens, and a George Romero zombie film all at once. Much like Star Wars, it had this singular and immediate independent identity that was forged from the still clearly visible interests of the kids who made it, a collage of influences that was more than the sum of its borrowed parts. Doom had an undeniably youthful energy about it. It was angry and angsty and completely obsessed with image and instant gratification in-the-moment gameplay mechanics that showered you in gore and explosions with a single button click. It was all surface and no depth, but what a surface! It was also playfully transgressive for a pop culture smash in the early 90s, and that transgressiveness played two different ways, I think. I imagine to adults at the time that the full version of Doom either felt a little sophomoric or unremarkably edgy. Cartoon gore and pixelated pentagrams weren't exactly scandalous if you were a 20-something who had grown up on 80s slashers or regularly listened to heavy metal bands. But to a 9-year-old in the early 90s Midwest, playing Doom felt like playing with fire. It was tempting but dangerous, a vision not meant for your eyes, but that made it all the more seductive. These days it's hard to picture Doom, a big-budget mega game full of ridiculously cartoony gore, as an edgy, almost dangerous game to play. But you have to remember that in the 90s, hell and damn were still considered serious swear words on network TV, and Bart Simpson was seen as such a controversial character for telling adults to eat his shorts that a lot of schools, including mine, banned shirts featuring the character. We were heading into peak Won't Somebody Think of the Children era, where video games were kids' entertainment that had anti-drug messages in front of them, not occult imagery and impaled bodies. It wasn't hard, even for a kid, to pick up on the tension between what adults were saying and this ominous, bloody, sacrilegious game being kicked around on some floppies all over school. Fun fact, Doom actually released the day after the original congressional hearing on video game violence, which had mostly centered around Night Trap and Mortal Kombat. We were just getting to a point where video game violence was of a high enough level of fidelity to be disturbing and gaining national attention, and Doom released its shareware version, that worked its way through all manner of schools, right as the wave began to swell. That said, I don't think many of the kids playing it knew just how transgressive it could be. Again, I find myself questioning the importance of the shareware version for the impressions it left. John Romero was responsible for pretty much all of Knee Deep in the Dead's levels, save the 4th level, which was started by Tom Hall but finished by Romero, and the big boss fight finale in Phobos Anomaly, which was done by Hall and Sandy Peterson. And I don't know if it's a result of his personal level design style, although Sigil indicates that it isn't, or part of a plan to have the first episode be mostly human military facilities, but it leans hard on the star-based set of textures and traditional boxy rooms and corridors. Doom saves most of its upside-down crosses and fleshy walls and jagged brimstone and mutilated corpses for its later 2 episodes. So while the version traded by kids was still full of guns and blood, the outright gory nightmare scenes and images of altars with still beating hearts and pentagrams mostly didn't make it into our elementary schools. Doom in 1993 was a smash hit. It wasn't the first FPS title, or even id's first FPS title, but it kind of became the archetype of the form simply by being so popular. Heck, until we settled on the term first-person shooter, they were called Doom clones, which makes me the billionth person to complain about the fact that we still call roguelikes, but whatever. Doom cast its shadow over the rest of the 90s and beyond, and the game's fascination with the irreverent, the impulsive, the angry, the youthful, the shallow, and the archetypically male would dominate the aesthetics of the genre for more than a decade after its release. If Wolfenstein 3D was id Software's rejection of Ultima Underworld's slower and more thoughtful mechanics, then Doom was the public resoundingly agreeing, for better or for worse. For a game that left such a tremendous impact on video games, in 2020 the original Doom feels weirdly small. The game's 3 episodes can be beaten in a casual 4 to 5 hours. It's not that hard compared to its sequels and expansions, and it's also not that deep. I'm one of the heathens that prefers Doom 2 to Doom, and I think one of the reasons why, having played them again side by side, is the scope of damage and power, both from the player side and from the enemy side. Doom has the rocket launcher, plasma gun, and BFG, but outside of the big boss fights at the end of each episode, they aren't really all that necessary. There aren't the big bruisers of Doom 2 to really absorb that damage. No Hell Knights or Revenants or Archviles or Mancubi or Arachnotrons. Heck, by Doom 2, Cyber Demons, while rare, are just a regular enemy type and not a boss. But here, in Doom 1, aside from the occasional Baron of Hell in episodes 2 and 3, the toughest non-boss enemies are cacodemons, which are medium to low threats in Doom 2. Consequently, most of the game is played with the shotgun and minigun, with occasional guest appearances by the rocket launcher or plasma cannon when other ammo is scarce or you see a big group of enemies together. Doom 2 has the ability to scale from small arms fire against zombies up to BFG fire against a city's worth of the undead, to go from juggling chain gun fire against cacodemons to pain them and prevent them from firing, to opening plasma cannon fire on a cyber demon you're trapped in a tight hallway with. Doom, the original, lacks that ability to scale its combat, and the result kind of feels like you're playing a demo of what the game would eventually become. One thing that's a lot easier to take note of when playing through the game today is how it tries to tell a story in its own kinda half-assed way. As stated, Knee Deep in the Dead mostly sticks to a star-based texture set, only really tipping its hand into the demonic influence towards the end when the final fight reveals itself to be inside of a giant pentagram. Players then visit the Demos base and Shores of Hell. This chapter has a lot of teleporters and experimental serum vats and overgrown nature areas that imply some sort of biological research is being done, culminating in a fight with a cyber demon. Between the "our labs have their own built-in upside-down crosses" and "the big boss of this episode is a mix of the monsters and our technology," we finally get the sense that maybe something isn't on the up and up with the UAC. But it's all left utterly implicit. Unlike Doom 2016, the bad guys here really are just the demons. Finally, in Inferno, you descend into hell itself, brimstone and jagged rocks and thorny brambles. Levels tend to mix wider open spaces with tight hallways. The levels in episode 2 and 3 also have a tricky sensibility to them, where Knee Deep in the Dead is much more what you see is what you get. Like, the very first level of Inferno has a false wall that isn't used pretty much anywhere else in the game, and E2M6, the Halls of the Damned, actually has a big fake exit button that plunges you into a pit of monsters if you press it. Anyways, yeah, upon finishing Inferno and killing the spider mastermind what planned the invasion, we see the gag with the rabbit and the burning city that sets up Doom 2. And the rabbit actually isn't all that important. It's weird that Daisy has kind of been retconned into being very, very, very critical to the Doom identity. Here in the original Doom, it's just a sting at the end of the game. You think you got away and teleported back to Earth safely, but oh no you didn't! It was a gory gag, the sort of thing that Adrian Carmack got a kick out of. It's also why Keen blows up a bunch. He hated cute stuff. It wasn't until Ultimate Doom was released later in 1995, with the additional Thy Flesh Consumed episode, that Daisy was retconned into being Doom Guy's personal rabbit. Anyways, the game's levels don't really make sense as spaces, but their design does tell a rough sketch of a narrative through environmental storytelling and a few light text blurbs. But the game doesn't really benefit once you pick up on this. Doom's at its best when it's this surreal tone thing, half-rooted in some vague fiction about a Mars base and a gateway to hell, and half just this waking nightmare about an ultra-violent gunfight in techno-gothic dread castles set to midis of metal music. Noticing that there is a bit of story structure to the level progression, a smidge of method to the madness, kinda detracts from the sense that the emphasis on tone over everything else was intentional. It's clear now the game kind of fell ass backwards into it. Its youthful obsession with image and aesthetics and music over being meaningful inadvertently gave the game its own kind of emotional meaning. It didn't reject narrative in order to explore the abstract, it explored the abstract because they were too busy putting in cool stuff to make the narrative coherent. But that's not the worst thing, because as we've learned in 2020, Doom with lore can be really awkward.
You'll make a fine addition to the front line, stranger.
The demons! They are everywhere. Must kill them all!
Doom in 2020 is also a lot more nebulous as a concept. As exemplified by my previous video, we kind of glom Ultimate Doom and Final Doom and Doom 2 and Doom all together a bit, as if they're a single entity. This wasn't the case. They were released from 1993 through 1996. But also, Doom in 2020 is a game engine that people are still actively developing with. That started to some extent shortly after its release, as its level design tools were made available and hundreds if not thousands of custom WADs have been made since 1993. But by GPLing the engine, the game was given even further life, not just with modern ports of Doom, although I'm certainly thankful for those, but also extensive mods that change how the game plays and feels, and even entire original games from platformers to horror titles to epic RPGs. Its low fidelity and ability to mock stuff up super quick makes it great for prototyping or sketching out simple ideas. In some ways, Doom in 2020 is less a singular game than an ecosystem where the original WADs by id Software are mostly a starter pack or demo reel for all that Doom can be. Going back and revisiting it today, it's still eminently playable in ways that Catacomb 3D and to some extent Wolfenstein 3D just aren't. It's part nostalgia and part comfort food. But more than that, it's like a base reference text. I called the show Children of Doom not just because of the fun Dune pun, but because Doom was the lodestar that directed so much game development that followed it. A flashpoint that sparked so much of the first-person genre, both the good and the bad. Doom started our pop culture reference-infused, ultra-violent, anti-intellectual, dude-bro shooters, but Doom also inspired FPS games to use spaces to tell stories with minimal words, to engage in abstract emotions rather than literal plot, and to open themselves up to modification. It is without a doubt one of the most over-covered, over-discussed games in existence, but it is for a reason. As far as contenders go, there really weren't all that many to choose from. And not just because Doom overshadowed everything else, but because there really wasn't much of note in 1993. There was Terminator Rampage, which mostly helps underscore why Doom succeeded. Most of the enemy weapons are hit scan, removing any defensive play, and movement and shooting are slow and unresponsive next to Doom's snappy running and hair trigger. I do, however, find this footage hilarious. Bram Stoker's Dracula had a wonderful sense of mood, but awkwardly tries to blend an Ultima Underworld-style interface with real-time shooting mechanics, and it never quite clicks. Like Terminator, it's also pretty slow. Elsewhere, Softus continued releasing Catacomb games through 1993 before slowly transitioning to an ISP instead of a disc magazine. If you like Catacomb 3D's hidden walls and spammy combat, then Catacomb Apocalypse is more of that. The only other release that was really of note in 1993 was a small project by Ken Silverman called Ken's Labyrinth.
Welcome to Ken's Labyrinth.
It's mostly a goofy shooter that has an almost Commander Keen Saturday morning cartoon absurd comedy sensibility, and the game itself has largely been forgotten. But it's an important game because it laid the foundations for Silverman to be able to write the build engine, which will undoubtedly power at least a few of the games we cover as we go forward.
Nice job.
Next time, we finally break from id Software to talk about another long-standing first-person shooter developer. It's 1994, and Bungie is about to introduce the first-person shooter to the Mac with Marathon.